Hey, welcome back to the channel where we talk all things engineering, technology, and finance. Before getting into today's content, make sure you hit the like button below and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that way you're up to date on all the latest content that we post to our channel. And lastly, make sure you share the video with friends and family. As I always say, we don't want to hoard the knowledge for ourselves and we want everybody to learn. So let's jump into today's content. Welcome back to Engineering Series where we learn a particular technology. And in this series, we're focusing on web development, specifically PHP. And we are on Lesson 3 today. And let's take a look at what we're going to learn for Lesson 3. So here's the agenda for today. The biggest thing that we're going to focus on now is syntax. When we look at syntax, there's particular sections in syntax that make that up. Now, when I say the word syntax, what does that mean? Every language that you program on the computer, or even in a general sense, any language, for example, we're talking in, there's syntax or rules that we have to follow. So that way we know what those rules are and we're able to effectively communicate. As I'm speaking to you through this microphone, I'm using sentences, and in those sentences, right, there's certain rules. When we have a period, we take a pause. Same thing when it comes to programming languages. We have what you see here, some of the things that we're going to go through. Case sensitivity, whitespaces, variables. And within the variables, you have strings, numeric. There's many different things that we have to go over so that way you understand what the language is and the rules of the language. So that way we can use those rules to create statements that are to be executed by the computer. Now, I'm not a big fan of teaching people through PowerPoints and boring them to death. So one of the things that I love to do is have code up. Let's get our hands dirty. One of the ways that I have learned how to program is by doing, and I expect you to do the same. So let's jump over into our code and run through some of these examples so that way you can learn the syntax of PHP. Now let's jump into learning about syntax, and let's hit each point that we talked about in the PowerPoint. First thing we're going to do is we're going to work with the Windows side, and then afterwards, for folks that are using either Linux or Mac OS, you can follow along on the Windows side and then apply the same exact thing for either Linux or Mac. Keep in mind that I will also, towards the end of the video, put in the same exact things that we're doing on the Windows side. We're going to do it for Mac and Linux. So don't think I'm forgetting about you guys and gals. First thing we're going to do is we're going to bring up the tools that we need in order to get started on learning on syntax. And the first tool that I'm going to bring up is Xampp. So let's go ahead and bring that up. So here is our Xampp control panel, and I'm going to hit start on the Apache web server. Now if you remember, Xampp allows us to test out our code in a browser. And the next thing that we're going to bring up is Visual Studio, right, our code editor. So here we go. We have Xampp and we have Visual Studio Code. Now that we've set up our Xampp and our Xampp is running, we effectively can just minimize that and get that out of the way. We really don't need that. If you're unfamiliar with what I'm talking about as far as Visual Studio Code or Xampp and how you set these tools up in order to get started, make sure you watch the previous videos on how to get started, and I'll make sure that I'll link that in the description below. Okay, so now that we have Visual Studio Code up, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a Lesson 3 file, and you're going to do the same, and we're going to create that in the directory that we need to put it in. If you recall from our last lessons, this file, right, our Lesson 3 PHP file, has to live in the htdocs directory where Xampp is. So let's go ahead and click File, New, and it says select the language. So I'm going to go and select PHP. Now that we have our new file up, let's go ahead and we're going to bring in our Html5 code. So I want you to go ahead and make sure that you have lines 1 through 15 exactly how I have it. This is your basic HTML code. There's not much going on here. All you have is the metadata that's built into the head of the HTML code, which doesn't really do much. What we are mostly concerned with is our PHP code is going to go into the body. make sure that you've copied the code as is, and we're going to continue working with it as we go along in the lesson. So now that we have this in our Visual Studio and we've copied it, we're going to go ahead and save it as, and we're going to travel into our C drive. So let's click on this PC. Let's go to our C drive. We're going to head over to Xampp. And as you recall, we're going to need to go into htdocs. And here is where our PHP code has to live. I'm going to call this lesson 3. And since we've already told Visual Studio Code that it is a PHP file, it already has the file type here, so it knows to save it as a .php. So that's very critical as well. Make sure that it's lesson3.php. So we're going to go ahead and save that. And to make sure that we verify that it's the correct thing, right, here's our path, C, Xampp, htdocs, and as you can see here, I called it lesson3.php, which tells us it's a PHP source file. Now that we're all set up with Xampp running, we have our Visual Studio Code up, we have our basic HTML code as well. We are now ready to talk about our first item that we went over in the PowerPoint, and that was case sensitivity. PHP is a language that is case sensitive. What does that mean? Case sensitivity means that every single character or every single letter that you write, however you write it, matters. So for example, when we think of the letters, right, we think of uppercase, lowercase, and depending on how you write it, it matters. So what do I mean by that? Let's take a look at an example. In order to let our PC know that we're ready to start our PHP code in this HTML code is by using less than question mark, and as you can see here, Visual Studio Code is actually starting to fill it out for me, PHP. And then how we end the PHP code is we do the opposite, question mark, greater than. So in between, right, now that we're in between these lines of code, this is where our PHP is going to go in. So now let's talk about case sensitivity, as we were saying before. How you write your code in PHP matters, and if you think about the letters, either uppercase or lowercase, they matter. So for example, what if I'm making a variable, and we'll go over shortly what a variable is. If I make a variable called, let's say, today's date, and we'll end that. Now let me create another variable, and we'll call it today's date, and we'll end that. So we'll create one more variable, and we'll call it today's date. Pop quiz. Are these all the same variables? Do they all mean the same? If you answered yes, as in they're all the same, you are wrong, actually. And this is what I mean by case sensitivity. Today's date, where the T in today and the D in date are capitalized, are completely different than today's date, where all the letters are capitalized, right? And today's date, as in all the letters are lowercase, that is all different. So this is what case sensitivity means, where even though I wrote the same exact name, as in today's date, they're all different because they are different in some shape or form, meaning one of them has 2 uppercase letters, the rest are lowercase. The next one, all of them are uppercase letters, and then the last one is all lowercase letters. And that's important to understand because when you write a variable or you're coding and you're using different letters, whether it's uppercase, lowercase, and it may look like it's the same thing you wrote before, it's not, and you need to be very careful on case sensitivity. 2 tips I'm going to give you when it comes to case sensitivity is, 1, when you have a global variable, typically best practice has been to make sure that your global variables are all uppercase letters. And in our case, we have line 15 that is all uppercase, and line 15 would be considered a global variable. And a quick little idea of what a global variable is, it's a variable that can be used anywhere in the program. And again, we're going to come up with examples so that way you can understand what that means, but just know for now that you use them all as uppercase. And the second tip that I'll give for you is when we have temporary variables that we are using in order to store data temporarily, best practice is to keep that temporary variable lowercase. And again, this all sounds foreign right now, but we'll touch on these topics as we go along, so that way you know what global variables are or what temporary variables are. Let's jump into the next topic that we talked about in the PowerPoint, and that was whitespaces. So taking a look at our code again, in order to make this a little easy, right, let's add in a comment, and we talked about that in our prior lesson. So if you remember is // I'm going to say this was lesson on case sensitivity. Okay, cool. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to paste it right under, and we can say lesson on whitespaces. And let's line that up to make it look nice. Okay. So now let's talk about whitespaces. In PHP, you have any spaces or any tabs are considered or what's known as whitespaces, and any combination of them are treated as that, as if they were on a single line. There are exceptions to that rule. The exception is when it's placed inside quotation marks, and that's typically part of strings, and we'll talk about strings a little bit later. But let's take a look at an example of what a whitespace is. So let's say we have a variable, and again, we'll talk about variables in a second or two, so hold with me on that. But let's say we have a variable x, and x is equal to, and we have another variable y plus another variable, let's say z. If we take a look at this statement on line 19, there is a space here, there is a space here, there is a space here, and there's another space here. That is what you would consider a whitespace. Now, we can write the same exact things using a tab space, right? So let's do that. X tab is equal to tab y, tab that, plus tab that, and z. So if we take a look at this example on line 20, we have a tab which is equal to a certain amount of spaces. We have another tab, we have another tab, and then we have another tab. So line 20 is exactly the same as line 19 because it's treated as the same, and that's what we call whitespaces. Let's do one more example. This is going to be a pop quiz. Make sure you put the answers in the comments, and we'll go through them and see if you're correct. Is variable x equal to variable y plus variable z? So that is the question for pop quiz. Is variable x equal to variable y, enter, meaning carriage return, and you're on line 22 now, plus variable z? Is line 21 and 22 the same as line 20 and line 19? Write it in the comments and we'll see what you get. White spaces, whether it's tabs, spaces, and, fun fact, another one is new lines or carriage returns. Those are all considered the same, and that is what we call white spaces. Now remember, the only rule to this is they're not the same when they are in quotation marks, and that is white spaces. Now that we know case sensitivity and whitespaces, let's head over and learn the next thing, which was variables. So heading back to our code here, again, let's create a comment. Let's type in lesson on variables. So what are variables? Variables are a container that holds a value. And what do I mean by that? So I like to use analogies, and some of the analogies that I like to use help me understand what we're talking about from a programming perspective into the real world. Let's bring our browser here, and let's talk a little bit about containers, right? So one of the great containers that I can think of in real world that can translate is a ship container. And if we look that up, let's take a look at some images here. I don't know if you've ever seen a ship container, but a ship container, and here's a great picture of it, is literally what it's called, a container that holds things, right? And so I don't know if you're familiar with how ship containers work, but we'll take a quick example. Here in my hand is an Apple iPhone or an Android phone, a OnePlus phone, and these devices, for example, an iPhone, they get designed here in the United States. They actually don't get built in the United States. And so designing and building is something different. So once the phone has been designed, the phone will go into what's called manufacturing. And when they manufacture the phone and make the phone based off of the design, the phone has to make its way back into the United States for us to buy. And what happens is they'll take a container, let's take a look at this one for example, and the container will hold thousands and thousands and thousands of iPhones, and they'll ship it from wherever it's made all the way to the United States for us to consume or us to buy. And so when we think about that process, this container holds all these iPhones. So now when we think about how do we apply that back into the programming world, we have a container, and the container holds values, or it holds the iPhone, and we can use and manipulate that however we want. So just a quick little analogy of what a variable is, and think of it, like I said, more like a container. It holds something. And in our case here, from the real world, this container is holding iPhones from the example that I gave you. So now if we go back into our programming, if we go back into our Visual Studio and we think about this container, X holds a value, Y holds a value, and Z holds a value. This variable, today's date, holds a value. As I showed you in the PowerPoint, there's two types of variables. There is a numeric variable and there is a string variable. Let's do an example on numeric variables. We can say numeric variable is equal to 100. From this example, we have a variable named numeric variable, and we assigned it a numeric value or a number, and the number is 100. Let's do another example. I'm going to copy this line. I'm going to paste it in the next line. We can call this one numeric variable 2. And we can give this a value of 200. Now I'm going to clean this up, make it look nice and pretty. Okay. And let's do one more example of a numeric value. We can say one more example, and that can equal to 300. So here we have three numeric variables, and I called it numeric variable 2,
And one more example, and it's 100, 200, and 300 respectively. Once you start creating variables and you assign them a value, for example, our case here where we have 3 variables and we assign 3 different values, you can start doing functions, or you can start doing things with those variables. In this particular case, I can do, for example, an operation on them, and one of the operations could be addition. And let me show you a quick example. Now this is just a quick example to show you what are some of the things you can do. And keep in mind, we'll go into depth in further lessons on what we can do with those variables. But I can create another one. Let's create another variable, and we can call that result. And we can say result is equal to numeric variable plus numeric variable 2. And I'm going to use something called echo, which means print to the screen. And we can print to the screen result. So let's go ahead and look to see what this gives us. I'm going to bring up my browser here. And remember, we want to type in localhost. And now that we've typed localhost, we can see a directory of htdocs, which is where we needed to save our lesson 3 from earlier. And let's run our lesson 3 PHP. As you can see here, we have the results of line 27 and line 28. So line 27 is actually doing the addition of the 2 numbers, and line 28 is our result. So 200 plus the 100 gives us the 300. Now, in much later lessons, we're going to talk about debugging, and we're going to take a look as to why we're getting all these warning signs here. These warning signs are part of line 19 through 22, but we'll tackle that in a later lesson. Let's talk a little bit about variable naming. And it's very important that we name our variables correctly, because that can also cause us problems. One of the first things that we always have to do when we are always trying to create a variable is it has to start with the $sign. If it doesn't have the $sign, you will always get an error. So make sure that your variable names always start with the $sign. The next thing to remember is it has to start with a lowercase letter, an uppercase letter, or an underscore. So what does that mean? You can start A through Z for your first letter. So let's say it can be R. Or continuing with that, it can be uppercase R. Or we can start with an underscore. But it always has to start with one of those 3. It cannot be a number. If we put in, say, the number 3, and we can say 3 is equal to 1. We are going to get an error on line 29 because we have not started with an uppercase letter, a lowercase letter, or an underscore. And if we refresh, we can see exactly that error. Right? Syntax error, expected integer 3, expecting variable. It knows you should have a variable, and it can't see that variable because you're starting with a number, and that's not valid. So let's get rid of that. Now, continuing with the example, the other thing you need to make sure that you don't confuse when you're doing variables are you can't have any punctuation or math operations in them. What do I mean by that? So say, for example, we have R, as we talked about before. I cannot have R exclamation point. If we use this, let's say R exclamation point is equal to 1. Let's bring in our browser again. As you can see here, we save the code, we refresh the browser, and we see here that there's a syntax error because it has the punctuation that we talked about. Let's do another example of how this can go wrong. Let's say instead of the punctuation, I use the plus sign as a math operation or an operator. Let's save this. Let's bring back our browser. Let's refresh. And as you can see here, we have a parser error. It is hanging up on line 29 with the plus sign. So let's remove the plus sign, and let's go ahead and see what we get after we remove the plus sign. So let's remove plus sign. We're going to go ahead and save that, and let's bring in our browser and refresh. And as you can see here, we fixed the problem and we're back to our results as before, right? We have the 300 from line 27 and 28. And then also as well, we have warnings that are being given to us, and that's based off of line 19 through 22. And again, we'll touch on that on another lesson. So let's get rid of line 29, as we don't need line 29. Now that we've spoken about numeric variables and different ways in which how we can name those variables and what's legal and what's illegal, let's jump into strings and how we can save strings in variables. So what are strings? When we take a look at strings, a string is just a bunch of characters put together. So for example, right, when we think of my name, Lewis, Lewis is a string of 4 characters. So you can replace my name with your name as you go ahead and code this up. So we are going to create a variable and we're going to call it name. And name is going to equal, and we're going to put this in double quotations. So we have double quotations, and I'm going to say Lewis. And we're going to end it with a semicolon. So now that I know my name is Lewis. And one of the things that we can do is we can put an echo in there, kind of like we did on line 28. And we can say, hey, computer, tell me my name. And we need to make sure it matches. So as you see here, it needs to be capital. And let's end the line. So we're going to save that. And let's bring up our browser and let's refresh. And as you can see here, we have 300 and my name Lewis. Pop quiz. And write in the comments if you know the answer why. Why is it that my number 300 from line 28 is scrunched together with my name that's on line 31? If you answered that you need a line break in your code in order to make sure that you separate the result variable with the name variable, then you are absolutely correct, and it gives you credit when you are able to go and find the answer. Meaning one of the things you have to do as a programmer is you have to learn how to find what you're looking for. You may not always have the answer, but chances are somebody else has solved that problem, and they've given you an example where you can use in order to make sure that you could apply it towards your code. So let's go ahead and make sure that we add a line break. That way we can refresh our code and we can see that if we bring up the example, the 300 and the Lewis will be separated. So we're going to go into line 28. We're going to add something that's called the concatenation, which is a period. And we'll talk a little bit more later about this, but in a nutshell is it combines two things together. So basically what we're doing is we're combining result with what we call the line break. One of the things we want to do is we want to make sure this goes into double quotes, so let's not forget that. We're going to save that, and let's bring in our browser, and we're going to refresh. As you can see here, 300 and Lewis are now on two separate lines. An example of how we can use variables with strings and combine them together, let's do a quick example of that. Let's create a variable called first name. Let's create another variable and call it last name. And I'm going to put my last name. You could do the same with yours. I'm going to come up with first name and put Lewis. So we've created two string variables, and one is called first name, the other one is called last name. Now we can do something like this, where we can say echo or tell me, print to the screen, my first name and concatenate together or put together my last name. And let's save that. Bring in our browser and refresh. And as you can see here, we have first name, last name. Now, if you remember from our previous example, right, we had an issue where everything was getting all scrunched up together. So how do we make sure that we put a new line between both Lewis's? So let's go ahead and fix that. So let's go to Lewis, and we're going to concatenate a line break. So let's go ahead and save that. Bring up our browser here, refresh, and there we go. We have Lewis Acosta. Now we have a line break between both Lewis's. Now the other thing that I want to do, because this doesn't look right either, is I want a space between my first and last name. So let's put a space between Lewis Acosta to make sure that that looks right. So let's go to our code. In line 34, we're going to adjust this. Let's get rid of the concatenation. We are going to put the variable first name and last name in a string by opening and closing the quotes, and then you just want to make sure that you have a space in between the first name and the last name. And we go ahead and save. Let's bring in our browser, let's refresh, and there you go. You have a space in between my first name and my last name. Let's do one more example where we can combine a numeric variable with a string variable and see how we can use that together. Let's get this out of the way. I'm going to create a new variable, and it's going to be a numeric variable. I'm going to call it age, and I'm going to say age is equal to 45. After we created our numeric variable of age and we assigned it the value of 45, I'm going to create a sentence with a couple variables, and I'm going to call it sentence is equal to, and we're going to say, hello, my name is first name, and we're going to use the first name variable. Also, our last name variable, and I'm going to also say I am, and we're going to use the age variable, years old. We're going to end that, and next I'm going to print to the screen a sentence. We're going to save that, and we're going to bring in our browser, and we refreshed, and we also get a warning sign on line 37. So one of the things about debugging, right, we got a warning on line 37 because I didn't use the proper variable name, and this is one of the things where we're going to have to go into how to name things properly, also keeping sure that you refer to them properly. So here you can see a lowercase, and I just changed it to uppercase. So let's go ahead and save that. Let's bring in our browser, let's refresh, and you can see that that error is fixed now. And one of the things that I want to do is I also want to break this up and put this into a new line. But as you can tell, my sentence was printed. Hello, my name is Lewis Acosta, and I'm 45 years old. Fun fact, I am not 45. I am much younger than that, but you get the gist of it. So let's go ahead and fix this. So we're going to add in another breakpoint. Let's bring in our browser. So we save that, bring in our browser, and as you can see here, hello, my name is Luis Acosta. I am 45 years old. That is on a new line, as we can see by adding the breakpoint on 34, line 34. We just went over some of the basic syntax in PHP. We talked a little bit about case sensitivity, whitespaces, and also as well variables, specifically numeric variables and string variables. And we did some examples, as you can see here on the code, of how to create variables, how to assign values to those variables, whether they're numeric or strings, and how you can take them and do particular functions with those particular variables. For example, we did an embedded variable where we took my first name and my last name and we printed out a sentence to the screen. So what I want you to do now is practice using and creating those variables. Change your name, make sure that you can put your name in there, and also as well with the age, and practice a little bit and see what you can do. There's some more details on variables that we'll cover at a later time, but just know that this is the basics and it'll get you started. Let's run this example in Linux and in Mac OS so the folks that are using those operating systems can continue to use those operating systems. But you just completed a basic overview of the syntax for PHP. We are now going to jump into how do we run the code that we went over on the Windows platform on Mac OS, so folks that are using Mac can understand how to do this. And keep in mind, we're not going to be going over the code in detail like we did for the Windows side. So make sure you watch the Windows portion of the video in order to go through the code. This is more so of, hey, how do we take the code that we went over and apply it on the Mac side. First thing we're going to do is launch Xampp. And here I have Xampp. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. We are going to click Start. Okay, now that our status is green means we're ready to go ahead and get started using Xampp, and this is the IP address that we're given. Next, let's go ahead and launch our Visual Studio Code. So let's go ahead and launch Visual Studio Code. So Visual Studio Code, I had left it in the downloads directory, so if we go and hover over the downloads, we can see that Visual Studio Code shows up here. And I'm going to go ahead and click Visual Studio Code to bring that up. Once Visual Studio Code is up and running, we're going to go ahead and click New File. We're going to select the language, and it's going to be, of course, PHP. Once we have PHP selected, now we can go ahead and type in our code that we did when we were working on the Windows side. Now, I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste the code in here. You should go ahead and type the code out to give you practice on how to use Visual Studio Code. But here we have our code, and we're going to save this in the directory that it needs to go in. So remember, we need to save this over to the Xampp directory. Before we could save this code, we need to make sure that we mount the directory for Xampp in order to make sure that we save this PHP file to Xampp. We save this file to where Xampp needs it to be. So let's head over to Xampp again. Let's go to Volumes, and let's click Mount in order to mount the /opt/lamp directory. Now that we have that mounted, we can head back to Code, or Visual Studio Code. Let's go to File, Save As. We see here the IP address from Xampp. Let's hit it into the LAMP directory. Let's go over to htdocs. Here we have Lesson 2. Under here, let's create a new folder. Let's call it Lesson 3. And then under Lesson 3, we're going to save this as lesson3.php. We're going to click Save on that. And we now have lesson3.php saved to the directory that Xampp is looking for. In order to bring up what we are looking for, we need to head back to Xampp, and we need to make sure we go under General. And this is the IP address that we're looking to type in Safari, which is our web browser. So let's go ahead and type that address in Safari. And in fact, actually, I'm a little lazy, so I'm going to just copy and paste that. But we're going to launch Safari. We're going to paste the IP address. Now that we go to the IP address, this is what we should see here. We should see the index, which we had lesson 2 directory, lesson 3. So remember, we saved it as lesson 3. Let's head over to lesson 3. Let's click on the lesson 3 PHP, and you will see the same results as you saw on the Windows side, which we got our warnings, we got our 300, we have our first name and last name, and we made a sentence. Now keep in mind, I want you also to practice. So go ahead into Visual Studio Code and play around with changing some of the variable names and some of the variable results and see what you get. Now let's move on to the Linux side of things. Here we have our Linux distribution. What we're going to do is take the code that we did in our Windows environment and put it in the Linux environment. But keep in mind, as we mentioned before, we're not going to go over the code again. This is just more of an opportunity for you to see how we bring the code into the Linux environment. You should have followed the Windows portion of the video that goes and breaks down the code. So let's go and see how we can bring the code into the Linux environment and run our Xampp in order to launch our code. So first thing we're going to do is, let's see where we are, pwd, so we're in our home directory. So let's take a look at what we have here. As we saw in previous videos, we launched our Xampp application, and if you remember where that lives, it's in the opt directory, which is the same thing in the Mac. So let's go into opt, and we should see a LAMP directory. Here we have our LAMP directory, so let's run our manager. What we're going to do is copy and paste. So let's run this with elevated privileges. Let's clear all this. So let's, with elevated privileges, run the manager Linux 64. Go ahead and type in our password. And here we have our Xampp application. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that our server is running, specifically the Apache web server. So let's go ahead and hit start on that. With our Apache web server up and running now, we can go ahead and launch our Visual Studio Code. As we remember in Linux, Visual Studio Code is just code. So let's go ahead and launch that. With Visual Studio up and running now on our Linux machine, we can click start with a new file. Let's go ahead and select the language as we were doing before, PHP. Once we have the language selected, let's go ahead and copy in our code to make sure that we have the same code as we did from our previous lesson. As a reminder, we are just viewing how the code works in the Linux environment. We are not going to go over the code itself. In order to go over the code, make sure you watch the Windows portion of the video. So let's go ahead and paste the code in here. Let's go ahead and file, save as. And remember, we're going to save it in the LAMP directory. So if we recall, it was in the opt/lamp, and under htdocs, we have a lesson 2, but we want to create a lesson 3 directory. So what we're going to have to do is, let's bring up our terminal again. Let's head over to the opt lamp htdocs, and let's make dir with a -p lesson 3. And of course, give it sudo privileges or elevated privileges. So now we have lesson 2 and lesson 3 directory. So let's head back to VS Code. So let's go file, save as, Let's change this to opt lamp htdocs lesson 3, and we're going to call this lesson 3. Now it looks like we have to open up permissions on that directory. So big thing here, keep in mind that this directory has to be open in order for you to write to it. So I'm just going to open it up for everybody. So we're going to do a chmod, and we're going to change the permissions, and of course make sure that's elevated. Now we should be able to write to that directory. So let's go to File, Save As, and let's go to the opt directory. From the opt directory, let's go into lamp. Once we're in lamp, let's head over to htdocs, lesson 3, and let's call this lesson 3. Now with our lesson 3 file saved to the htdocs under lesson 3 directory, let's go ahead and bring Xampp back into the picture. We can go and click the option that says go to application. It's a nice shortcut to get us to open up a browser, and you can type in the localhost. It's a shortcut, and then we can go into lesson 3 and click on lesson 3 PHP, and of course you have the same results as far as our 300 number, our first name, first and last, and also as well we have the sentence that we created. And as you can see here, we have a little different behavior where the warning signs are not shown, but this is just to show you that this is how it runs in the Linux environment. When you're doing web development, you always want to make sure that you test it out on all different platforms. And that wraps up our demonstration on running lesson 3 in the Linux environment.
There you have it for today's content. Remember, don't forget to like the video, and as we mentioned, subscribe to the channel so you're up to date on all the latest content that we post to the channel on all things engineering, technology, and finance. Finally, don't forget to share the video with friends and family. We always say this, we don't want to hoard the knowledge for ourselves, we want everybody to learn. So make sure you share the video with friends and family, and we'll see you on the next video.